Okay, hi and welcome everyone. We're just gonna wait a couple of minutes to give folks some time to join. Thank you so much for being with us today. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Julie Aguilar and I'm a research analyst at the Terner Center. And so we're really excited to be hosting a conversation on the latest legislation to support housing supply and land use reforms in California. So now that Governor Newsom has signed these bills into law, we are looking forward to a lively conversation with experts on what these bills will mean for California's housing landscape. But before I get started, I would like to thank the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and the Heising Simmons Foundation for their support of our work on housing policy. And so we will be recording today's conversation and we'll make it available on our website. So with that, we will start the webinar with a short presentation to provide a brief overview of supply and land use bills that will be going into effect in California next year. The presentation is based on a commentary that we just released last week, which will be linked in the chat. So please feel free to check it out if you haven't already. And then after that, I will turn it over to Bill Fulton, our Terner Center Fellow, to introduce our panel and start our moderated discussion. And then we will have audience Q&A, so you can share your questions using the Q&A feature at any time. Okay, so before we turn it over to the panel, I'm going to quickly cover notable housing supply bills, specifically ones that encourage housing production, ones that encourage or that created shot clocks to help with emergency rebuilding, ones that are related to ADUs, and then some that made changes to the regional housing needs assessment process. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so this year was a big year for housing supply and land use reform, where we saw several efforts to encourage housing production. So first, we saw two significant reforms were passed before the end of the session through the budget negotiation process, where major CEQA provisions were included in two budget trailer bills. So we have AB 130, which created a CEQA exemption for infill housing projects of up to 20 acres. And then the other major bill, SB 131, states that rezonings that are required as part of housing elements will also be exempt from CEQA. SB 131 also limits the need for environmental review on projects that would have been exempt, except for that one environmental impact. So these reforms are meaningful changes to California's environmental review process. And then one of the most notable bills this year was SB 79, which expands transit-oriented development. So SB 79 allows greater height and density for housing projects near high-frequency rail stations and bus lines with frequent service and dedicated lanes. Preliminary estimates we've run in collaboration with Terner Labs actually show that at least in some cities, SB 79 could have quite a significant impact. And in fact, it could even help San Diego achieve nearly half of the city's RENA allocation. And then we have several other bills that expand on previous legislation. So for example, AB 893 expands on AB 2011 from 2022, which allows some housing on commercial corridors to be approved ministerially, but it includes parcels located within half a mile of a public university. And then we have AB 1021, which makes it easier for K through 12 school districts to build housing on their land. There's also AB 1061, which softens the exemption for historic resources and landmarks under SB 9, the lot split law. So originally, historic districts were exempted under SB 9, which meant that parcels within those districts couldn't be split and redeveloped into two homes. But AB 1061 changes that to exempt only historic resources and landmarks instead of the entire historic district. And then we have even more bills that are meant to encourage housing production. So we saw legislation that streamlines student and staff housing. So AB 648, which exempts housing projects that are proposed by community colleges from local zoning. We also saw bills that encourage office to residential conversions. So we have AB 507, which expands an existing office to residential incentive that was only available in San Francisco to the entire state. And then the bill also allows by right approval for certain adaptive reuse projects. And then we also have AB 1445, which expands the use of enhanced infrastructure financing districts for office to residential conversions. This was also only available in San Francisco, but now it's available to the rest of the state. So this would allow the use of incremental property tax revenue, which is generated from investments in commercial to residential projects to finance these office to residential conversions. And then we have stronger enforcement of housing laws. So under AB 712, applicants who successfully sue a local agency to enforce compliance with housing laws can collect attorney fees. And then the bill also increases fines on local governments that do not comply with housing laws. Okay, and then there were also bills that implemented shot clocks to help with emergency rebuilding, which emerged from efforts to rebuild and repair after the Los Angeles fires. So AB 818 mandates that local agencies decide on permit applications after a disaster within 10 days of receipt and waives impact fees for some emergency situations. And then there were several bills that ensure permits are issued in a timely manner, like AB 1007, where permit application review by responsible agencies was shortened from 90 days to 45 days. There's also AB 301, which extends the time limits for post-entitlement review of housing projects so that state agencies, like local agencies, will now have 15 days to determine completeness of an application and 30 to 60 days to review, depending on the size of the project. Meanwhile, AB 253 allows applicants to use a private plan check reviewer if the local government takes longer than 30 days to finish the permit review process. And then we have AB 920, which requires all jurisdictions with a population of over 150,000 to have an online central housing application portal by the year 2028. And then there are also a couple of bills related to ADUs or accessory dwelling units that might accelerate housing production. So under AB 1154, junior accessory dwelling units that have their own sanitation facilities, like a restroom, will not have owner occupancy requirements like ADUs. And then we have SB 543, which requires local governments to determine whether an ADU or a junior accessory dwelling unit application is complete within 15 days, or else it will be deemed as completed. And then we also saw changes when it comes to the regional housing needs assessment. So SB 233 and AB 1275 set timelines for HCD and councils of governments in preparing RENAs in the 7th cycle, which is coming up in the late 2020s. AB 1275 also says that RENA must be informed by sustainable community strategies, which metropolitan planning organizations need to include in their regional transportation plans. So these sustainable community strategies are long-term plans that align transportation, housing, and land use to help California meet our climate goals. So this is really an effort to make sure that the way we plan our housing and transportation systems are aligned. And then we also have SB 507, which allows local governments to enter into voluntary agreements with tribes to build housing and have those agreements count towards their RENA target under certain conditions. And so that concludes the presentation. If you'd like to learn more about these bills, please feel free to read our commentary. And so with that, I am now honored to hand it over to Bill Fulton, Terner Center Fellow and leading expert on land use and housing policy, who will introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion. So Bill is a professor of practice at UC San Diego. He is the former director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University, where he did extensive work highlighting the growing affordable housing problem. Among other roles, Bill has served as Director of Planning and Economic Development for the City of San Diego and as Mayor of Ventura, California. And then he is also the author of 6 books, including The Reluctant Metropolis, The Politics of Urban Growth in Los Angeles, and LA Times bestseller. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Julie, and good morning, everybody. It's great to have so many people here and all ready to begin having some questions in the Q&A. We're going to have a we're going to have a conversation here, and then we'll turn it over to try to answer some of your questions. So again, if you have a question for our panelists, please put it in the Q&A. Don't put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. We have a distinguished panel, three panelists. We have, and if you could, oh, there we go. We're all on now. Sasan Madanat from W Strategies, thank you for being with us. Susan Horry from the Manat Law Firm, and Mohammed Alamadine from formerly of the Terner Center and now of California YIMBY. Let me begin by asking all of you kind of the same question. We've seen lots and lots of bills passed every single year for several years. How would you rate the potential impact of these bills this year, like on a scale of 1 to 10, compared to what we've seen in the past? Susan, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you, Julie, for the presentation. I'm very pleased to be here. Really appreciate the invitation to be here with my colleagues. I would say this year, I'd give it maybe a 7.58, pretty solid ranking, I think, this year. I think we saw some genuinely meaningful steps that were taken within the legislature this year, especially around transit-oriented development, clarifying some streamlining measures, and post-disaster rebuilding. As always, the real impact is going to be in implementation. But I do think that we took some big swings this year and we were very successful. As Julie reviewed, there were some really meaningful bills that passed this year, and I'm very excited about that.
I want to get back to the question of implementation a little later, because that is always the big question. Mohammed, how would you rate this year?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's nice being on this side of the webinar now. You're doing a great job moderating, Bill. Amazing presentation, Julie. It's great to see everyone in the Turnerverse again. But yeah, I would rate it also an 8. I think, TOD development, that's been something that has been worked on for the last maybe 8 years. CEQA infill exemption this year, no one thought really it was possible. At least not for the next 5 years. That was made possible through 2 different bills. But the reason why it's an 8 is that we've done a lot on zoning and streamlining, but now it has to be cost reduction, so then housing could actually get built.
And Susan, from your perspective as a practicing attorney, how would you rate this year, and what do you think some of the, how important are the bills this year versus the bills in the last few years?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Bill and the Turner Center, for inviting me to participate, and I'm happy to comment and share my opinions on these very important set of legislation that we saw this year on housing. I probably rated also at about a 7.5. I think that AB 130 and the CEQA exemption, the expansion of it, and the changes that were made to that, I think were incredibly important, especially for those who are in the home building business, because CEQA has been one of the biggest stumbling blocks, I think, in terms of being able to get through the process quickly. SB 330 has various shot clocks, but one of the shot clocks it did not have was on the CEQA process. And so you have a lot of housing projects getting tied up in CEQA. So I think that was a very significant change. And I think SB 79 will also make a huge difference. I've always told people that, in the past, the housing bills have been helpful, but they've sort of nibbled at the edges. We're talking about ADUs. We're talking about, building on strip centers or within church parking lots, kind of small areas. But I think that this package of bills this year went a lot further than what we've had in the past.
I want to go a little bit further, Susan, and ask you about the CEQA exemption. There has been a categorical exemption for infill in the past. What's the difference between that categorical exemption and this new statutory exemption? And how much do you think that this new statutory infill exemption will be used? And how much of a difference will it make?
Okay. Well, as you said, there has been the urban infill exemption, the Class 32 categorical exemption that has been on the books for a number of years. The main difference, I think, is there are a couple of differences. So let me go through them in quick order. Number one, acreage. The urban infill exemption was basically a 5-acre limit. This expands it to 20 acres. AB 130 expands it to 20 acres. Also, the urban infill exemption required that you do certain technical studies to demonstrate that the project did not have any impacts on certain areas, such as air quality and water quality. And in order to substantiate that, you'd have to have some technical studies. That same requirement is not in AB 130. So it, I think, expedites the ability to avoid having to do a lot of technical studies. I'm still going to tell people that AB 130 does have various criteria. So you are going to have to go through each of those criteria and I think put evidence in the record that the project clearly falls within and satisfies those criteria. But it's certainly not as extensive as what was in the Class 32 exemption. And lastly, as you know from a lot of CEQA litigation, there's been questions about what does the exception to the exemption mean? That's in, the use of all categorical exemptions. And AB 130 eliminates that as well. So I think that those are some of the big changes between the two, why AB 130 is probably more user-friendly than the Class 32. I should mention, however, that I'm sorry, Bill, that the AB
No, go ahead.
130, I'll just say real quickly, AB 130 does include a tribal consultation measure that was not in the Class 32 exemption, and that's going to create, its own procedures and requirements with respect to Native American monitoring.
I've always been waiting for the exception to the exception to the exemption. But Sosan and Mohammed, could you talk? The other big bill this year was SB 79. Can you each talk about? Julie indicated that the potential impact is considerable. Could you each? We'll start with Sosan. How big of an impact is SB 79 really going to have? How is it going to be? What do you see about how it's going to be used?
Well, I think SB 9 has the potential to make a huge impact. As Susan briefly mentioned when she was speaking, it's a meaningful step toward predictable by right production near transit. And I think it's one of the biggest steps we've seen legislators take in the last 10 years. Some folks may remember or have read articles about Senator Wiener's attempts at this over the years. This has been 8 years in the making. And I think, truly the impact of SB 79 is going to depend on a number of different factors. We went through, I think it was somewhere around 13 rounds of amendments on this bill. It took, a lot of work for us to really get it to where it's at now. But I say that to highlight that there were some significant factors that we had to consider and limitations on the bill to continue moving it forward. But it does provide, more consistent approvals for infill projects. It gives a lot greater flexibility for both affordable and mixed income projects. And it really does shift towards corridor level planning rather than parcel by parcel, which I think also provides developers with a lot more certainty. And so I think just that gives us the opportunity to build a lot more. And I think we're very excited about the potential.
Yeah.
Mohammed, let me ask you that, the YIMBYs were really excited about the passage of this bill in a way that I don't think I've ever seen the YIMBY movement excited about anything as much as this bill. I could be wrong. Why is this such an important bill to the YIMBY movement, and what do you expect the impact to be?
Yeah, I will say that for the YIMBY movement, this was sort of the bill that helped found the YIMBY movement like 8 years ago in California, right? It was SB 827, later SB 50. And, it's been on lull and now it's finally passed, which is like massive upzoning near transit. So it's interesting about like the implementation, right? Because we're already seeing stories of like cities that are trying to skirt implementation. That is something that we sort of have to wait and see. I think when it comes to bills in the past, like we've learned sort of like through SB 9 and like through other bills, how like the state could help ensure that implementation of state law is correct. But the other factor here, And like, this is an exciting bill because even through those 13 amendments, like the density standards are still there. It does upzone a majority of areas near transit across the state. But we have to think of the market. Who's going to be the first one to do it? Who's going to be the first mover to do this in Los Angeles? Who's going to be the first mover to do this in San Diego? Because right now, development and capital is very hesitant to work in the California market. There's a lot of, right, you think of the Millennium Tower, you think of graffiti towers in LA, you think of like these previous like construction high-rise efforts that were as successful in California, and the capital markets noticed. So there has to be a first mover using this bill for more people to feel more comfortable. But it's also difficult when there aren't comparables for that sort of development. So really it all depends on, and right, we have tariffs, we have labor shortages, we have all these issues when it comes to construction. That's why focusing on costs for next year, reducing costs for housing construction is so important, and making the market feel more comfortable about housing construction in California. I think that's the next step that the whole state needs to take for its full impact to like sort of blossom in the next like 10 years.
I want to come back to that question of reducing housing costs because I know Assemblymember Wicks and others have begun to highlight that. But I did want to ask all of you about SB 79, a question that the local government people on our call might be interested in, might want to know more about, which is, although the upzoning is mandatory in these locations, local governments, cities can create an alternative plan where they can move the density around. I was speaking to one local official yesterday who welcomed that possibility because they thought it might help to move development near these transit stations when they are also in high fire risk areas, move it around. I've talked to a lot of people who say maybe the cities may not have actually the capacity to do these alternative plans. I'm wondering how big of an effect, how frequent for all of you, including Susan, how frequently do you think you're going to see these alternative plans take place, and how much of an effect is that going to have? Is it going to make it more desirable to build, less desirable to build? What do you think? Anybody? Susan, you haven't spoken to SB 79, so I'll start with you.
Well, I was going to say, Bill, living in Orange County, we don't have a lot of areas that are a limited number of areas that are going to be subject to that. But I think that the cities will probably want to see how this is implemented, and then probably as updates to the housing elements come forward, I think that would be a great opportunity to come up with alternative plans. I think that should be worked into the next round of certainly housing element amendments.
Sultan and Mohammed, do you have any thoughts about the alternative plans? Sultan, you look like you're about to say something.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I'll just say, the reasoning behind this was to really acknowledge that some local governments are already planning and moving in that direction. So in working on this bill, as one of the lead lobbyists on SB 79, and in working on this, we really were trying to be responsive to some of the concerns we heard from local governments about capacity and constraints, and for those local governments that really are, pro-housing. I say that, though, also to acknowledge that there's not a need, right? It's not a requirement. Local governments may adopt these plans where they see fit. They
don't have to do it. They don't have
Correct.
to do it.
Correct. Yeah. And so it allows them to do that where they want to, and to move that density around in ways that they see fit and appropriate for the communities.
Mohammed, any further thoughts about the alternative plans?
Oh, it was answered perfectly by my other two panelists. Yeah, this is optional. You don't have to do it. I will say that the term online that has been coined for these plans are Eckhouse plans, named after Aaron Eckhouse. So we could start calling it those now.
The Eckhouse plans, Aaron Eckhouse being one of your data geniuses at California YIMBY, right?
Yeah.
And there are a variety of maps floating around possible SB 79 locations. I know California YIMBY did one. I know others have done them. So that's probably worth looking at in your local area. I'm curious. I believe one of you said at the very beginning that the issue, I think it was you, Sosan, it was the issue is always about implementation. And I'm curious, and we'll start with Susan, because since you're a practitioner, what are the biggest implementation challenges you see to moving forward and implementing the bills that were passed this year?
I think number one is just the familiarity with some of the procedures. I'll give you an example. AB 130 has a very short time frame for initiating tribal consultation, which is a mandate under that law. It's 14 days, and a lot of cities, I don't think, were quite prepared. Once all of the applications came in and said, we now qualify under AB 130, we want our application processed this way, and all of a sudden the cities found themselves under a 14-day, time frame in order to get the Native American consultation process going. I think that is a short-term issue, and that as they go through the process a couple of times with the applications, I think that this will become much more standard. I think so. I think that's certainly one of the issues that we've seen. I think that cities are still working through SB 330. So I think part of it is that there's been a lot of legislation that the cities have been hit with, and trying to reconcile them, trying to understand what are the different shot clocks under SB 330 versus AB 130 versus SB 131. I think that there's just a lot of legislation for them to figure out and how to reconcile. And then that's been an implementation issue.
And it's certainly put a strain on the local planners to keep up with all these bills every year. Sosan and Mohammed, do you have any thoughts about what? Let's start with Mohammed this time. What do you see as the biggest implementation challenges?
Yeah, definitely. I will agree. Like, there is limited capacity for cities to keep up with all the new housing laws. I do think it is an opportunity for like more information sharing with cities, especially with implementation guidance or implementation memos, especially from like state agencies like HCD, right? Like HCD's guidebook for ADUs and SB 9 are like really looked after. I think we could do more when it comes to the implementation front when it comes to cities. I will also add that developers are not keeping track of all these laws. That's also an issue. Right, like when I talk to the development community and they're like, oh yeah, SB 9, and it's like, well, that's kind of SB 1123 is a lot better. Like you should look at SB 1123. You should look at oh, you don't know that like this is streamlined within the process, like this is ministerial now. Like, and they're like, huh, I had no idea. Like there's just a lack of information for the development community as well on like what state laws and levers that they could pull. And I think also another big implementation challenge is local governments, developers, but also state bills could work together, right? Like I wonder how many people like just don't know that AB 2097, which is the parking exemption within a half-mile transit, works with SB 79. Right. And you could also use an SB 330 application. And there's like density bonus law. Like there's all these things that are like in the mix. Like the plethora of options, I think, is what's most difficult when it comes to implementation.
Sosan.
I would agree with my colleagues. I think, interpretation and guidance, I absolutely also recognize capacity constraints on planning departments, given the number of bills that we've run. I also think funding is a really big one. Financing and putting funding towards supporting a lot of these projects is going to be a big challenge to implementation moving forward.
Can I jump in, Bill?
Please,
I've got
please.
another concern about implementation, and I think one has to do with public education. Mohammed mentioned the fact that we have formerly discretionary approvals, which have now become ministerial. Some of them have become ministerial, and I think that for the public who may not be aware of that and understand the difference, that when it becomes ministerial, there may not be a hearing, and that and that their ability to comment on projects may be somewhat different and limited. I think that's been a challenge for a lot of cities in dealing with their constituents. Also, with an SB 330 project, we recently had this situation come up where people were commenting on aspects of a project that were not really relevant to public health and safety, which are the two focus in terms of, when a city can disapprove a project. And so I think education, both with the cities as well as the decision makers and their constituents, has been a challenge and will continue to be a challenge as we adopt these legislations. But it's really important for people to understand what that does in terms of the public process.
So people continue to, just a second, Mohammed, people continue to comment, for example, on aspects of the project that a city no longer has any discretionary control over, for example.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. Mohammed.
Yeah, I'm part of my local community planning council in Rockridge, right? And like there's this new development being proposed. I think it's in 1893, and we have another one that's like an SB 1123, and everyone's like, what's going on? When can we comment on this? Like, this is terrible. And it's like I'm on the other side of it, of like fielding these complaints, and I'm like, oh, well, I understand why we passed the laws in the first place, but someone needs to tell them that kind of like that process isn't really available anymore.
One of the things that came out this year was the creation of a statewide VMT bank as an option for VMT mitigation. I'm wondering, Susan, as a practitioner, could you talk a little bit about what's the state of the art of VMT mitigation now? How well is it going? What are the issues? And will this new statewide VMT bank actually help, or should there be regional VMT banks, for example, which has been discussed?
Well, I think there actually has been some progress made on VMT banks and methodologies that various cities and counties are looking at. I know that San Diego has looked at this. I think Riverside is looking at that. I think also the San Gabriel Valley is also considering that within the Southern California area, because a lot of times what you will find is that they have projects in front of them where maybe the only impact is that they can't mitigate is VMT. And there's only so many bike lanes, there's only so many school bus shuttles, there's only so many, HOA pamphlets that you can provide in order to reduce the VMT impacts. And so I know builders and developers are really struggling to find ways to effectively address VMT. So of course, as you mentioned, AB 130 did include a VMT provision, which allows for I'm basically going to quote here, if a lead agency determines that you will have a significant VMT impact, you can mitigate the impact to a less than significant level by helping fund or otherwise facilitate vehicle miles traveled, efficient, affordable housing or infrastructure. I think that that was certainly an attempt to find a way to mitigate it. But I think the big question mark, certainly in the home building community, is what does this mean? And, Mohammed's been talking about costs, and this goes directly to the issue of costs, because the costs of this, whether it's a fee, whether it's a program, whether it's, imposed as a condition, I think that can really raise the cost of building. And I think that there's just this huge question mark on this particular provision.
Mohammed, what's your thought about the VMT mitigation situation and the possible, using affordable housing as essentially transportation mitigation, for example?
Yeah, I'm not so well versed on this, unfortunately. I will say that with my experience when it comes to VMT maps and mitigation, I know that just the mapping itself of like low VMT areas has been an issue for developers and local governments. Like that really needs to be honed in, especially when we're passing more legislation when it comes to reducing VMT. That's really all I have to say when it comes to that. Is like everybody needs to have the same information to be able to build in the right places and to utilize laws that really do incentivize building in low VMT areas. I know Los Angeles has a pretty good portal when it comes to mapping out low VMT areas. It really helped with like ED1 back in the day of where you could build and use AB 2345 or AB 2335. I don't remember, but other places don't have such sophisticated software when it comes to development.
Okay. A couple of more questions, and then we'll turn to the audience questions. Please continue to put your questions in the Q&A. I'll begin with Sosan on this. We're toward the end of the year, the beginning of the year. The beginning of 2025, of course, involved a horrific conflagration in the Los Angeles series of fires in the Los Angeles area. What did we see coming out of the legislature this year that might actually facilitate rebuilding? And does it encourage simply rebuilding what was there before, or are there incentives to rebuild in a different and more resilient way?
Yeah, it's a great question, Bill. Thank you so much. The devastating fires at the time when they happened in January, as you mentioned, really gave legislators, I think, the opportunity to look at ways that they could respond, because it was at the beginning of the year and session had just started. We saw a package of bills move forward this year that really attempted to respond to the loss of homes and the destruction in LA. I think, what we saw was a few bills that moved forward, a package of bills that were pushed by leadership and a number of members from Los Angeles that do both, to rebuild in places, where we lost housing, but also incentivize construction and to expedite the construction of housing in some of those locations, but also to be thinking about how to build smarter and more efficiently in those areas, given that we are now seeing wildfires occur in places where we traditionally and historically did not see. So that might mean, looking at AB 253 by Assemblymember Ward, I believe, was part of the fire package to really expedite reviews and to encourage and address some of the concerns we were talking about earlier with limited capacity at the local level, and to work with private reviewers to move permits quicker through the process. That's one example, right? And so I'm really grateful that the legislature took this so seriously and responded so quickly, because I do think we will see an impact. I will say too, all of those bills that moved through that package had urgency clauses in them, which means as soon as they were signed by the governor, they went into effect. Rather than waiting for January. Exactly.
Mohammed, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I see. When it comes to the questions, I have to talk a little bit more of the challenges. I have to say, first of all, the legislature did a great job working and getting these bills passed, especially urgency clauses. It has to be a 2/3 vote, right, Sosan, for it to happen immediately. So everybody in the legislature kind of came together and supported these bills. Some of the challenges here, I have to say, is that, from plan submittal to plan check takes in other states maybe 24 hours, but in the fire rebuild areas, we're still seeing about 2 months for that process to happen. And in other states, this isn't necessarily an emergency, right? So what are some of the limitations that we have within California to ensure that we could get these rolling again? How do we get permits and everything go through within less than a week's time? I think that's important. I'll also say another challenge is sort of this villainization of state laws when it comes to rebuilding in fire devastated areas, most notably SB 9 recently. Some of the first developments in Altadena are SB 9 developments. It's going to be finished before Thanksgiving, I think by Green Development Co. And it's a woman whose house burned down. She's able to increase the size of her original home and build another unit next door and rent it out to someone else that was affected by the fires. And I think leaning into state laws and streamlining is really the path that we need to take. The local government can do so much as well. I think it's just both. But to overcome some of these challenges, we really need, people's lives are affected. People had to move. People have their lives have been devastated. This should be a top priority for us, because in other states where fires happen, they either rebuild quickly, like natural disasters, or they take a long time. And California kind of has the choice of what it wants to do. So I hope next year that even more will get passed, and more can be done at the county level, so we can ensure that more homes are rebuilt.
I want to move on to next year, and then we'll move on to after that, we'll move on to the questions from the audience. And we'll start with you, Susan, since you're in the middle of it there.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk. Mohammed mentioned this, but there's been a lot of discussion by a lot of people that the legislature is going to have to start tackling the question of the cost of building housing. So
Yes.
I guess my question for all of you is, what does that look like? What does that specifically focus on? And does that mean less emphasis on what we might call zoning reform, or do they and more emphasis on other things, or do those continue to go together in some way?
That's a great question. I think we will see a bit less of an emphasis on zoning and streamlining. I think a lot of legislators are feeling like we've done big things with that. I anticipate we'll probably be seeing some legislation in that space, possibly some cleanup legislation, looking at, loopholes that we might need to close. I have been hearing that home ownership is finally on the table, which I will just say I'm very excited about. I formerly represented Habitat for Humanity. I've worked with a number of organizations that have really been beating the drum on home ownership and the importance of that. And as we are talking about cost reduction, I think it's not only about how do we reduce the cost of constructing the buildings themselves for developers and nonprofits, that are building these products, but also reducing costs for individuals, the people of California. We know that that's the top of the list as inflation is, skyrocketing and folks are seeing groceries and housing costs increase. And that dream of homeownership for many is continuing to be out of reach. So I'm excited to hear about that. And then on cost reduction, I think we're going to see ways that we might be able to reduce fees if possible, looking at potential financing mechanisms to develop some of these projects, like these small lot homeownership projects that we've actually passed legislation to legalize over the last few years, but we'll need some implementation and support from the state to move forward. So those are a few that I'm hearing right now.
And Mohammed, what are you hearing about next year, and particularly about the question of reducing cost?
Yeah, when it comes to reducing cost, fees have been a part of the conversation. How do we reduce fees, or where do we move fees? There's a bit on the building codes. How do we reduce costs through the building codes? There were a number of bills that didn't quite make it so far, and we think the building code conversation is sort of the new frontier and something that we find quite important. Another thing is that we've passed a lot of great bills, but it takes years to refine them. So I can imagine like some cleanup legislation on years past, right? Like ADUs were so successful because it was like a 3 to 5 year effort to get it right. So I can imagine the same thing for other bills that were passed recently. As Susan has mentioned, a lot on just sort of the financing mechanisms, what's allowed in the private market, but also what could be done at the state level to de-risk housing construction in California and to make changes to the capital stack.
Susan, what are you hearing from your developer clients? And Mohammed has mentioned a couple of times there's some hesitancy to invest in housing development and construction in California, which might be suppressing overall production. I'm curious, what are the high priorities from your clients about what the legislature might do, and is there in fact hesitancy to invest more than there should be?
Well, I think the hesitancy just comes from the financial markets in general, in terms of where the economy is going and how easy it will be to get financing for projects. I mean, I do hear a lot about the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty in the financial markets in terms of investment in California. I don't know if it's California specifically, if it's with respect to certain types of products, but I know that there is a hesitancy and uncertainty out there regarding the economy. So that's an overall concern. I think specifically, with respect to California, I would agree with both of my fellow panelists. Fees are an issue. The other thing is, we mentioned building codes. There are a lot of projects that have been approved but not necessarily vested, and they're now facing rising costs with respect to compliance with the new building codes that go into effect in January. And so that's causing a lot of projects to have to go back and redo performance and take a look at how that will, impact their project. And of course, you've heard me talk about the VMT provision. And I think that it would be nice if the legislature went back to provide some clarity with respect to that provision of AB 130. And I think, in terms of what I do, as you've heard me say over and over, Bill, time is money. And so the AB 130 really helps with exempting certain projects through CEQA, but there are still other projects that have to go through CEQA, and getting through that process, as well as potentially facing litigation, is a huge issue in terms of both the cost and time. And litigation are basically from probably 2 or 3 groups: NIMBYs, project competitors, and labor. So, how we can address that and reduce the impact of litigation and how it extends a time frame and provide greater certainty to home builders is certainly something that we'd all be interested in.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn it over. I want to bring up some of the audience questions now. I can't guarantee we're going to get to all 85 of them in 15 minutes. But I do want to, but I'm going to skim through them and try to find the ones that might be of broadest interest. And one of the questions has to do with the near miss exemption in SB 131, which allows more limited CEQA review if you miss an exemption by only one condition. Susan, can you explain what that calls for, and what are your thoughts about what the impact of that is likely to be?
Well, I think that the near miss exemption is that if you have a project which qualifies for an exemption, however, there is one impact area, let me say water quality, that is significant. And therefore, all the impacts cannot be reduced to less than significant, rather than having to do a full-blown mitigated negative deck or an EIR that looks at all of the potential impacts of a project. This new provision would allow you to just focus in on that, do an environmental analysis on that one issue. Frankly, it is such a new provision. What that document is going to look like and how quickly it can proceed through the process is something that I think we all three would probably just have to make wild predictions on. But I think by narrowing the scope of study, hopefully that will help reduce both the costs of the studies and the documents, as well as the timing.
Here's a very specific question about SB 79, and whoever wants to answer this can. The global question is, will SB 79 supersede all current zoning for an eligible site? More specifically, if the current zoning says 50% residential, 50% commercial, does SB 79 eliminate that and allow 100% residential?
You're muted. If you're going to say something, Susan, sorry. Let me. Oh, sorry. Let me. I don't want to give like a definite answer here, so I want to read through the bill amendments that we wrote and look a little bit at like case law and a little bit on like sort of some of the letters that were sent out through the Housing Accountability Unit just to give you a definite answer.
Yeah, that'd be good. We're just skipping through here just to ask a couple of questions. One question is, it would seem like, and Mohammed, you mentioned SB 1123 earlier. One question is, it would seem like SB 123 has bigger potential than SB 79. Why do you think SB 79 would have a bigger impact, and if so, why?
That's really interesting. Because I know SB 1123 has been taking off at the rate like ADUs were in like 2019. We're seeing just a lot of SB 1123 projects across the state. It's more of a wait and see. Like, I want to see how many developments are going to be proposed under SB 79, just because, like, versus 1123 in like the same area. I will say there's just SB 1123 works across the state. SB 79 is just like certain hubs in certain transit districts. But like if you build like 200 units versus like 20 SB 1123 projects, like it's a race. But let's see who does better. Does small infill build more housing, or will it be like these big mega projects? I feel like everyone in the housing space is kind of like questioning who's going to win, you know?
Yeah. Another question, Sosan, I want to come back to you. You mentioned home ownership, and there is a question about whether there's going to be more of an emphasis on home ownership. Could you talk and you said yes. Could you talk a little bit about what you see forthcoming in the legislature next year regarding home ownership? And again, not just for the home owners themselves, but perhaps for people building ownership opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I think this actually dovetails nicely with Mohammed's point about 1123. Senator Caballero ran SB 684, and I believe it was 2 years ago, and then the follow-up legislation SB 1123 to make it easier to do split lot, and to streamline the split lot process in order to build more housing for home ownership to sell those properties. What I will say is that we've been collecting information from some of these small developers that Mohammed was just mentioning about some of the barriers and challenges to actually utilizing that legislation, both pieces of legislation, to the fullest extent. So we are having conversations with folks that are on the ground, and we've been receiving that feedback, and we're actually looking at addressing some of those barriers that have been coming up over the last couple years. I will also say a bit of a third rail issue is condos. So, this has been coming up in a lot of conversations, and I would say this broadly in condo reform. It's an issue that we're hearing that has been tried over the years. It is a controversial issue in terms of trying to make condos easier and less expensive to build and removing barriers for developers to build condos. But we know that that is actually one of the easiest entry points into home ownership. And so really taking a look at what those barriers are, looking to other countries or other states that maybe have removed some barriers or made it easier for developers to actually build, and trying to use those as a model or an example, whether it's deposit reform and possibly looking at ways that we might be able to make it easier for developers to build based on allowing more money to go into the actual construction of those condos themselves. Those are some high level ideas that we're hearing.
Going to adapting another question, playing off of what you just said, what's the current status of like the condoization of ADUs at this point?
So, I mean, I know Mohammed can jump in here too, but AB 1033 from a couple years ago was passed, which actually allows local governments to opt into allowing ADUs to be sold separately and to create the condoization. It is not a statewide mandate, but it is an opt-in at the local level. And we've actually seen a number of local jurisdictions opt into this legislation. And there have been a few projects, as I understand it, maybe Mohammed can correct me if I'm wrong, that have either broken ground or are already moving forward. Is that correct, Mohammed?
Yeah. So we have about 7 or 8 cities now that have opted into AB 1033. The Casita Coalition, I'm also a board member there, has been tracking the implementation of this law. There is some cleanup due just when it comes to the process of the AB 1033 process that would help incentivize more construction. But San Jose has just finished its first few AB 10. They were the first ones to implement and the first ones to see like ADU condoization take off. I know of about like 3 or 4 more jurisdictions that might adopt AB 1033. I also wanted to add, when it comes to SB 1123, I know there's a huge question about implementation. Los Angeles has the best implementation memo for SB 1123. If you're a local planner, just go and copy and paste what Los Angeles did and just put that as your ordinance. Like, just make your job a lot easier. And that's sort of the thing. It's like, we just need that information sharing there. So just adding that in there.
We have a few minutes left, and we're obviously not going to get to all the questions. I want to go back briefly to SB 79 again. We talked about the alternative plans. I think this question is correct, and this is one of the reasons why cities have been wondering whether they have the capacity. I think this is right, that SB 79 requires alternative plans to be approved by next July. But I think that's right. But Susan indicated it might make sense to collapse them into the next housing element cycle. Does that seem like a step that might be taken, assuming that this question is correct?
I'll defer to Suzanne, who's probably way closer to that issue than me.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Bill? I'm so sorry.
The alternative plans in SB 79, the questioner thought, and I think this is right, have to be done by next summer under SB 79. Would it make sense to change or extend the law to allow it to be, as Susan suggested, part of the next housing element cycle?
Mohammed, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I could jump in.
Sure.
I think when it comes to sensitive communities, it's a much longer time frame. I think it's like about 5 years. Like full implementation of SB 79, like throughout the state, would be by like 2031. If you look at the different phases of who opts in and when they could do their EC house plans, full to get into the housing element cycle, no comment.
Does one bill that did not get through this year in any form, but is potentially a 2-year bill, is a social housing bill? Mohammed or Susan, do you want to talk about where that stands and whether what is being proposed and whether that has any shot next year?
Could I take this one, Susan?
Sure.
We're waiting for this impeccable, amazing study coming out of the Terner Center when it comes to social housing. And when that's submitted to HCD, then I think the legislature will have more interest. But we're just waiting for that great proposal from UC Berkeley on how this could work in California.
There you go. Not to put any pressure on us or anything, right? One interesting question having to do with bills from previous years is how broad has the uptake been on SB 6 and AB 2011? Maybe one of you could explain again what those bills do, and then have they had an impact? And again, do they interact, Mohammed, like you said, with the bills that are being passed this year?
So like AB 2011 projects, I know that there have been a few proposed in the state. I'm not sure any have broken ground. There was a bill, AB 893 by Student Homes Coalition, that helped streamline and clean up the process near universities. The issue when it comes to tracking AB 2011 or SB 6 sites is that cities have to report that APR data every 4 years. So we're actually not going to have real numbers until 2 years from now. So that's when we could have a better sort of view of how many units are being developed by these bills.
A question that somebody that you may or may not want to address goes like this. I understand the most recent DOF population projections represent a significant downward revision in future population growth or zero population growth. How do you think this will impact the RENA housing law environment going forward? In other words, if population growth ends, do we still need more housing? Go ahead, Mohammed.
Susan, do you want to take it?
You can start. You can start. Yeah. You can start us off.
So if there's population degrowth, but we haven't built enough housing in the last 40 years, there is an overcrowding of housing in most of California, and rent burden and burden when it comes to paying off mortgages, when it comes to income, is just so high that there is a need for housing supply. The real question here is that if population goes down, can you still charge impact fees? And that's something that I think cities might need to grapple with. And I know you've mentioned a few times, Bill, but if there's no growth in population, could cities charge an impact fee when it's supposed to be for new residents? I don't know.
Right. That's a good question.
After the sheets decision
Is there a difference between new residents and new development? Right, I think is the question there. Well, we are out of.
Oh,
Susan, go ahead.
I was just going to say very quickly. I mean, if population growth is going down, we're not going to see that for at least another, 10, 15, 20 years. We're at a housing deficiency as it is right now. We're losing young students, meaning people who are graduating from college, to other states or other areas because they can't afford a house in California. So there still is a housing supply issue and a housing affordability issue. And I think that we still need to see more housing built, period.
So there's
I
a
agree.
complicated interplay actually between housing supply and affordability on the one hand and population growth on the other, as you just said. If housing is too expensive, people may leave, etc. Okay. We're out of time. I want to say thank you. Thank you to the several hundred people who tuned in. Thank you, Sosan, Mohammed, and Susan. On behalf of the Terner Center, I believe this video will be posted as soon as possible on the Terner Center website. So thanks again to all of you, and we'll see you next time around at another webinar.